Welcome to the narrated PowerPoint presentation for Chapter 13, Alternative Evaluation and Choice. Next. In Chapter 12, we learned about the first two steps in the consumer decision-making process, need recognition and search for information. Now, in Chapter 13, we're going to consider the next two stages, evaluation of alternatives and choice. First, let's think about alternative evaluation. This involves making judgments about various alternatives and then using those judgments to narrow down the list of all the brands we could buy and actually make a choice. Next, learning objectives. Know what consumers make judgments about and be able to recognize examples, such as presence of features, levels of features, etc. Know techniques marketers use to influence the consumer judgment process, such as focusing on specific attributes. Be able to recognize examples. Consumers don't always base their judgments just on the physical characteristics of a product or service. Consumers can base their judgments on a variety of characteristics. These may include attributes, that is, attributes of the product itself, and that may include either physical attributes or other attributes like price or the image of the brand. We also consider both the presence and the levels of features. An example of presence would be if you are evaluating different smartphones, you may consider the fact that one has an expansion slot for an SD card that would allow you to expand the memory capacity while another does not. And when it comes to levels of features, you may consider the fact that one has more internal memory than another alternative does. As I mentioned, we also may consider other attributes such as country of origin. We may think about the benefits provided by the features. We may consider the amount of value a particular benefit provides, or how products compare to one another. I've already given an example in the smartphone comparison, if one product has a feature that another lacks. Any one of these could serve as an anchor in a given situation. So, now, knowing that consumers form judgments by anchoring on a characteristic they consider most important and then adjusting their evaluation as they consider additional information, and also knowing that the anchor is very important, carries more weight than the other characteristics, how do you think marketers could influence the judgment process? The answer is by focusing attention on specific product or service characteristics they would like consumers to use as the anchor. See the next slide for an example. I mentioned before that country of origin is one of the factors consumers may consider in forming judgments about a brand. In this ad for Beck's, they're clearly focusing on the fact that Beck's is a German beer. Everybody knows Germans make good beer, and so they're focusing consumers on that fact, hoping they will use that as an anchor in their evaluation process. Next. In this ad for a Hyundai SUV, Hyundai is clearly trying to focus the consumer's attention on price and then also trying to effect the adjustment process by presenting other attributes of the product in the smaller text of the ad. Next. Learning objective. Know the issues affecting consumer judgments and be able to recognize examples. There are a number of different factors that influence the judgments consumers form about brands. This slide shows some of the more common factors that influence consumer judgments. However, please note that this list is by no means all-inclusive. One factor that can influence our judgments is our ability to discern differences between different alternatives. This is known as the just noticeable difference, and it's something we'll study further in a later chapter. But the important thing to keep in mind here is that consumer judgments about products may not be accurate if they can't recognize differences between the alternatives they're comparing. Marketers, being the clever types that they are, often will attempt to take advantage of our inability to judge differences between alternatives in order to achieve their goals. See the next slide for an example. Many store brands, like Walmart's Equate brand, take advantage of our inability to discern differences by making their products look similar to leading brands. In fact, the term for this is look-alike packaging, and you can clearly see it operating in these examples. The idea, of course, for the store brand is to position themselves as closely to the leading brand as possible. The hope is that consumers will see the similarities between the two brands and judge that they are about equal in quality. Next, another factor that can influence our judgments is attribute correlation. Attribute correlation simply means that we often make judgments about features based on their perceived relationship with other features. For instance, one of the most common is the relationship between price and quality. Most consumers tend to associate a higher price with higher quality. Can you think of other examples? Pause the presentation if you need to. We do this sort of thing all the time. One example would be making judgments about the quality of a restaurant by looking at the number of cars in the parking lot. Next, quality perceptions is another factor that can influence our judgments because of the difference between objective or actual quality and so-called perceived quality. Our textbook points out that improvements in objective quality may take as many as 6 years to be recognized by consumers. This is one of the problems American car makers like GM have faced. Although the quality of their products has improved dramatically, many consumers still perceive that Japanese and European cars are of higher quality. Another factor that can influence our judgments is brand names. Brand names influence consumer judgments because we tend to associate certain characteristics with well-known brand names, like quality with Mercedes, safety with Volvo, reliability with Toyota. Also, unusual or descriptive brand names can influence our judgments because we make inferences about the characteristics of the product based on the brand name. See the next slide for an example. What kind of inferences or conclusions do you draw about these different brands of hot sauce based on the names? Next, learning objective. Understand the difference between features and benefits and why it is important to focus on benefits when marketing to consumers. Before we get too far into the subject of evaluative and determinant criteria, it's important that you understand the difference between features and benefits. There's an old saying in marketing: consumers don't buy a 1/4 inch drill bit, they buy a 1/4 inch hole. In other words, consumers don't buy the features or characteristics of a product per se. Instead, they buy what those features do for them. Another similar statement you may have heard is sell the sizzle, not the steak. In other words, consumers don't buy features, they buy benefits. Now, marketers should never assume that consumers understand the benefits associated with a certain feature. For example, if you're shopping for a new computer and you see on the packaging of the computer that a particular alternative operates at a clock rate of 4.6 gigahertz, that doesn't mean you'll automatically know that the computer is fast. If you're an expert on computers, you probably will, but if not, that may mean nothing to you. As obvious as this seems, it's a common mistake marketers make. Research has shown that when consumers understand the benefits associated with product features, they're able to make better decisions and after the fact are able to explain their choices to others. Next, here's an example of an advertisement that focuses on benefits rather than product features. If you read the text of this ad, you see that it doesn't talk about the features of the product, such as the fact that it has a curved last or a cushioned insole. Instead, it focuses on benefits. the fact that it protects your spine, tones your muscles, helps you stand up straight and walk the way you were meant to. This sort of information is more likely to influence consumer judgments and choice than a mere listing of the attributes of a product. Next, not all evaluative criteria are equally important. Determinant criteria, or determinant attributes as they're sometimes called, are the criteria consumers use to actually choose one brand over another. Although research has shown that consumers have the ability to evaluate many different attributes when evaluating alternatives, as many as 10 or 15, the fact is that we seldom do. One of the interesting things about determinant criteria is that we usually base our choice on just one or two. If we think brands we're looking at are pretty similar on certain criteria, we tend to neglect that criteria and focus on the one or two things that make the alternatives different from one another. For instance, our decision about which car to buy often comes down to just one or two attributes. Although you may initially go into your alternative evaluation with a long list of criteria, gas mileage, the comfort of the ride, how good the stereo is, the color, the brand, all these sort of things. When we actually get to the point of choosing a final alternative, the one that we're going to purchase, it may come down to just which one has the best color or which one has the best stereo. These one or two criteria then become the determinant criteria for this decision. We'll take a closer look at this when we look at consumer decision rules later in the chapter. Of course, which criteria become determinant will vary depending on the consumer's preferences and the situation. For instance, a consumer might consider gas mileage a determinant attribute when buying an automobile for himself, but consider safety the determinant attribute when buying an automobile for a daughter or son. The fact that determinant criteria vary across consumers and situations can be a real challenge for marketers. Of course, marketers want to position their products based on the attributes consumers will use to make their choice. In other words, the ones they will consider determinant. So figuring out which attributes are determinant is important, and marketers use a variety of marketing research techniques to determine, or at least to try to guess, the criteria that consumers will most likely use when judging their products. See the next slide for an example. In this ad, Apple is hoping that consumers will consider thinness to be a determinant criteria when evaluating notebook computers. Prior to the introduction of the MacBook Air, which at the time it was introduced was the thinnest notebook computer, consumers really didn't give much thought to how thin their laptop or notebook computer was, because all computers were about the same in that regard. However, since the introduction of the MacBook Air, thinness has become a determinant criteria for many consumers, and in fact most consumers nowadays expect all notebook computers to be very thin. Next, we also have to make a distinction between hedonic and utilitarian attributes. These are not new terms. Recall that you were first introduced to these back in chapters 1 and 2. That word hedonic, if you'll recall, it's used a lot in consumer behavior, and it's derived from the word hedonism, which means pleasure seeking. So, hedonic means related to pleasure. Examples of purchase decisions in which hedonic attributes are often important evaluative or even determinant criteria include vacations, automobiles, restaurants, clothing, entertainment, and art. For these kinds of products, sometimes rational decision making just does not apply, even though the purchase may be quite expensive and carry substantial risk. Utilitarian attributes, on the other hand, are the functional or economic aspects associated with an alternative. In other words, the practical aspects of it. Many products and services possess both hedonic and utilitarian aspects or characteristics, and marketers will use one or the other depending on the target market. Next, these two ads illustrate. Vehicles are obviously a product that possesses both utilitarian and hedonic aspects, and you can see how these two different manufacturers are promoting these different aspects of their vehicles. In the case of the Hyundai ad, the focus is on utilitarian aspects like fuel economy, and obviously in the ad on the right, Isuzu is focusing more on the hedonic aspects. Next, learning objective. Know the various factors that determine the evaluative criteria used by consumers and be able to recognize examples. Not surprisingly, there are several factors that can influence the evaluative criteria that consumers will use in making a purchase decision. One of these is so-called situational influences. These are just factors that are present at the time a purchase decision is being made. For instance, you may consider different criteria if you're buying a product as a gift for someone as opposed to if you're buying that same product for your own use. Another good example of a situational influence that we can all relate to is how much money we have to spend at the time we're purchasing a particular product. Another factor is product knowledge. Product knowledge is important because consumers with more knowledge of a product category are able to quickly zero in on the evaluative criteria that will be determinant in making a selection, and they're better able to ignore irrelevant information. Also, different sources of information can affect the evaluative criteria that we might use. For instance, consumers often rely on experts or social contacts like friends and family members to help them decide which attributes to think about when evaluating alternatives. The reason we rely on these sources is because we consider them to be trustworthy, and we often follow their advice. Also, although they're not trusted as much as experts or social contacts, we also sometimes rely on online sources and marketing communications like advertising or salespeople to help us decide what attributes to consider when evaluating alternatives of a particular product. Like the ad for the Apple Notebook computer we looked at a few minutes ago. Next,